The island was small enough that, on clear days, it appeared no more than a dark shape resting quietly against the horizon. From the mainland, fishermen could see the lighthouse rising above the rocks, its pale tower standing unchanged against the slow movement of the sea. For decades, the lighthouse had been staffed by rotating keepers who worked long, quiet shifts, tending the light, checking equipment, and recording weather conditions. The routine was predictable, almost comforting in its repetition. In the early autumn of 1978, a keeper named Thomas arrived for what was expected to be a routine 6-week assignment. He had worked coastal stations before and was familiar with the silence that often came with isolated postings. On his first evening, the sea was unusually calm. Gentle waves brushed the rocks, and the lantern's beam swept across the horizon with its usual quiet rhythm. Nothing about the first few days felt unusual. Supplies were organized, the generator functioned normally, and the nightly light rotations proceeded without interruption. It was on the 5th night that Thomas first noticed something he could not immediately explain. Just after midnight, while reading at the small wooden desk, he thought he heard a faint sound above him. At first, he assumed it was nothing more than the structure settling. The lighthouse tower was old, and shifting temperatures often caused the metal framework to expand or contract, creating subtle noises that echoed through the stairwell. A few minutes later, the sound came again, a slow, measured step, followed by silence. Thomas stood, walked to the base of the staircase, and looked upward. The narrow spiral disappeared into shadow, illuminated only faintly by a small maintenance light several floors above. He climbed halfway up, checked the landing carefully, and confirmed that nothing appeared out of place. Returning to his quarters, he made a short note in the station logbook. For the next 2 nights, nothing unusual happened. The winds picked up slightly, and the sea became more active, producing the familiar low sounds that filled the air around the island. Then, just after midnight on the 8th night, the sound returned. This time it was clearer, not loud, not rushed, simply the faint suggestion of someone walking slowly along the upper staircase. Again, Thomas climbed the tower, checking each landing carefully. The lantern room was empty, the mechanisms turning exactly as expected. He made another log entry, noting the repeated stairwell noise and the absence of any visible cause. Over the following days, the pattern remained the same. Long stretches of complete silence were occasionally interrupted by the faint sound of movement somewhere above the keeper's quarters. While reviewing older station records stored in a metal cabinet, Thomas discovered a collection of previous logbooks dating back several decades. In one of the older volumes, he noticed a brief entry written many years earlier mentioning occasional tower steps heard during calm nights, with no clear explanation recorded. As the weeks passed, the footsteps did not become louder or more frequent. They remained exactly as they had been from the beginning, occasional, measured, and strangely calm. Near the end of his assignment, a supply boat arrived to transport the next keeper to the island. During the handover, Thomas mentioned the unusual stairwell sounds, noting that he had never found a clear cause. Years later, the lighthouse was eventually automated, leaving the tower unstaffed but still operating. Maintenance crews who occasionally visit the station report that the structure remains quiet most nights. And though no official explanation has ever been confirmed, some visitors have quietly mentioned that the old spiral staircase sometimes carries faint echoes that resemble slow footsteps, continuing upward toward the lantern room. The lighthouse still stands today, its beam sweeping steadily across the dark sea, silent, watchful, and unchanged by the passing of time. Story 2. The light that turned on by itself. Along a quiet stretch of coastline stood a lighthouse that had not required a full-time keeper for many years. Advances in automation had allowed the beacon to operate remotely, monitored from a mainland control station. From a distance, the tower appeared unchanged, its pale walls facing the sea just as they had for decades, though the small keeper's house beside it now stood empty and silent most of the year. Local fishermen were familiar with the structure. During daylight hours, they often passed the rocky shoreline where the lighthouse stood, using the nearby waters as part of their regular routes. At night, however, the area was usually dark. Since the lighthouse had been decommissioned years earlier, the lantern was rarely expected to shine, except during occasional maintenance tests scheduled well in advance. One autumn evening, a small fishing crew returning to harbor noticed something unusual in the distance. Far along the coast, where the inactive lighthouse stood, a narrow beam of light appeared to be turning slowly across the water. At first, the men assumed it was a vessel positioned near the shore, but the steady rhythm of the beam suggested something fixed, something elevated. As the boat moved closer, the outline of the lighthouse became visible against the dim evening sky. The lantern room at the top of the tower was glowing faintly, its beam sweeping across the waves in the familiar pattern once used to guide passing ships. None of the crew recalled any notice of maintenance work scheduled for that week. When the fishermen reached harbor, they mentioned the sighting casually to the harbor office staff. The report was noted, though at first no one considered it particularly unusual. It was possible, they assumed, that a short diagnostic test had been carried out remotely, activating the light for a limited period before shutting it down again. The following night, however, another fishing vessel reported the same thing. Once again, the lighthouse appeared to be operating, its beam turning slowly across the dark water, despite there being no scheduled maintenance activity recorded by the coastal authority responsible for the structure. A technician reviewing the system logs found no evidence that the light had been activated from the mainland control system. According to the records, the lighthouse had remained inactive throughout both nights. Believing the fishermen may have mistaken another light source for the beacon, the technician made a brief note and continued routine monitoring duties. 2 evenings later, a coastal patrol vehicle traveling along the nearby cliff road also observed the lighthouse lantern glowing for several minutes before gradually fading again. This time, the sighting was documented more formally, and a maintenance inspection was scheduled for the following week to ensure the electrical systems were functioning correctly. When the inspection team arrived, they found the tower secured exactly as it had been left during the previous service visit. Power connections were intact, the automated rotation system was switched off, and no mechanical faults were detected that might cause the lantern to activate on its own. During the inspection, one of the technicians climbed to the lantern room and paused for a moment beside the large glass panels overlooking the sea. The room was quiet, filled only with the distant sound of waves moving against the rocks below. No residual heat suggested that the light had recently been operating. After completing the checks, the team concluded that the lighthouse systems were functioning normally, and that the earlier sightings were likely the result of distant vessel lights or atmospheric reflections. The report was filed, and the station remained inactive. Yet over the next several months, occasional reports continued to surface. A passing cargo ship captain mentioned seeing a rotating light along the shoreline one foggy night, and a pair of coastal walkers claimed to have noticed the lantern glowing briefly just after sunset before disappearing again. None of these sightings lasted long. The light, when seen, appeared only for a few minutes at a time before fading, leaving the coastline in darkness once more. Because the events were irregular and brief, no further inspections were scheduled, and the reports gradually became local stories rather than official incidents. Years later, the lighthouse was converted into a historical landmark occasionally visited by maintenance staff and survey teams. During one routine visit, a worker reviewing older maintenance files noticed the archived inspection notes mentioning unexplained reports of the lantern activating without recorded system commands. Standing at the top of the tower, the worker looked out across the wide stretch of sea, the horizon quiet and uninterrupted. The lantern room remained inactive, its mechanisms still and silent, just as they had been for years. Residents in the nearby coastal village sometimes still speak about the nights when the lighthouse appeared to shine unexpectedly, guiding nothing in particular across the empty water. Most assume the sightings were caused by distant vessels or unusual weather conditions bending light across the horizon. Whether the reports were simple misidentifications, rare electrical fluctuations, or something less easily explained, no official cause was ever confirmed. The lighthouse continues to stand along the quiet coastline, its tower watching over the sea as it always has. And on certain calm nights, when the fog drifts slowly across the shore and the water reflects even the faintest glow, a few late travelers still claim to see a brief, distant beam turning once across the horizon, appearing quietly, then fading back into darkness. Story 3: The Empty Logbook Entry. The lighthouse stood on a narrow stretch of coastline where the cliffs dropped sharply into the sea. For many years it had required a resident keeper, someone responsible for maintaining the light, recording weather conditions, and ensuring the equipment continued operating through the long winter storms that often struck the region without warning. In the winter of 1962, a replacement keeper named Alan arrived to begin a temporary 3-month assignment. The previous keeper had requested early leave for family reasons, and the transfer had been arranged quickly, leaving only a short handover period before Alan took responsibility for the station. The lighthouse itself was modest in size, consisting of a narrow tower attached to a small living quarters building. Supplies were delivered once every 2 weeks, and during storms, the station could remain completely isolated for days at a time. On his first evening, Alan followed the usual routine, checking the lantern mechanism, reviewing maintenance notes, and reading through the station logbook to familiarize himself with recent activity at the lighthouse. The entries appeared ordinary at first: wind speeds, equipment inspections, routine maintenance reminders. Each page reflected the quiet repetition typical of remote lighthouse postings. Near the final pages of the previous keeper's entries, however, Alan noticed something unusual. One page contained only a single line written in neat handwriting, followed by several blank lines that had never been filled. The line read simply, "Light functioning normally. Unusual sound in tower again tonight." No further explanation had been added. Assuming the keeper had intended to elaborate later, Alan turned the page, but the next entry resumed routine notes made several days afterward, with no further mention of the unexplained sound. That night, the sea was calm, and the tower remained quiet. Alan completed his checks and retired early, expecting the assignment to be no different from other coastal postings he had worked in the past. Shortly after midnight, while sitting at the small desk reviewing weather reports, he thought he heard a faint metallic echo somewhere above him. Not loud, but distinct enough to draw his attention toward the spiral staircase leading to the lantern room. He waited for several moments, listening carefully, but the sound did not repeat. Assuming it had been caused by wind moving through the upper ventilation openings, he returned to his paperwork. Over the following days, the routine continued as expected. Supply deliveries arrived on schedule, The lantern operated without issue, and no further unusual sounds were heard. Then, one evening just before dawn, Alan again heard the same faint metallic echo, a soft movement somewhere high in the tower, followed by silence. Curious, he climbed the staircase to inspect the lantern room. Everything appeared normal. The mechanisms were functioning correctly, and no loose fittings or tools were visible that might produce the sound he had heard. Returning to the keeper's quarters, he briefly considered writing a note in the logbook but decided against it, unsure whether the sound had been anything unusual at all. Later that week, while reviewing older archived logbooks stored in a cabinet near the equipment room, Alan noticed a handful of similar short entries scattered across different years. Brief mentions of unexplained tower sounds, each written without further comment. None of the entries suggested anything alarming, and none had been followed by reports of equipment failure or structural issues. The notes simply appeared, then disappeared into the ordinary rhythm of daily records. As the weeks passed, Alan heard the sound only occasionally. Never loud, never prolonged, and never at the same time twice. It remained a quiet detail of the tower, something noticed but never clearly explained. Near the end of his assignment, he made a final review of the station logbook before preparing the handover for the next keeper. After a brief pause, he added a single entry beneath the day's weather report. Light functioning normally. Tower remains quiet overall. He considered mentioning the occasional sounds, but ultimately left the entry simple, unsure whether the detail was significant enough to record. Years later, when the lighthouse was eventually automated and no longer required permanent staff, many of the old logbooks were archived and stored by the coastal authority responsible for maintaining the historic structure. Visitors who occasionally review the records sometimes notice the scattered notes written decades apart, small references to quiet sounds heard in the tower during calm nights, each entry brief and matter-of-fact. Whether those sounds were caused by shifting metal, changes in temperature, or something less easily identified was never determined. No investigation ever found a mechanical fault associated with the reports. Today, the lighthouse continues operating automatically, its lantern maintained remotely, while the tower itself remains closed to the public, except during occasional maintenance visits. Standing inside the spiral stairwell, maintenance crews sometimes remark on how easily small echoes travel through the structure, even the faintest movement carrying upward toward the lantern room high above. And though no official explanation has ever been recorded, a few visitors quietly mention that, on particularly calm nights, the tower sometimes seems to hold sounds longer than expected, as though footsteps once heard there have not entirely faded away. Story 4: Voices in the Storm. The lighthouse stood on a rugged coastline known for sudden weather changes. During calm summer months, the surrounding waters appeared peaceful. But in winter, the same shoreline became one of the most unpredictable stretches of sea along the region, with storms forming quickly and often lasting through the night. In the late 1950s, the station was operated by a small rotating crew of keepers who worked extended shifts during the storm season. Their responsibilities included monitoring the lantern, checking structural equipment, and maintaining detailed weather observations that were later sent to coastal authorities. One winter evening, Keeper Daniel arrived to begin a 2-week assignment just as a powerful storm system was forming offshore. The wind had already begun rising by the time he reached the station, and waves struck the lower rocks with steady force throughout the afternoon. As darkness fell, the storm intensified. Rain struck the lantern windows in rhythmic bursts, and the wind produced a continuous low sound that echoed through the tower's stairwell and living quarters below. Daniel was familiar with these conditions. Keepers were trained to expect unusual noises during severe weather. Doors shifting slightly under pressure, metal fittings vibrating, and air currents moving through narrow ventilation passages in the structure. Shortly after midnight, while recording wind speeds in the logbook, he thought he heard something unusual beneath the constant storm noise. A faint sound that seemed almost like a distant voice carried briefly through the wind before fading. He paused for a moment, listening carefully, but the storm quickly swallowed the sound. Assuming it had been the wind passing through the tower openings, he returned to his work without further concern. Several minutes later, the same faint sound returned, slightly clearer this time. Not loud enough to distinguish words, but distinct enough to resemble voices calling from somewhere beyond the rocks below the lighthouse. Daniel stepped outside onto the narrow observation walkway, holding the railing as the wind moved strongly around the tower. The coastline below was dark, illuminated only by occasional flashes of distant lightning reflecting across the water. He scanned the shoreline carefully, looking for any sign of vessels or people who might require assistance, but the storm conditions made visibility extremely limited. No lights appeared on the water, and no movement could be seen along the rocks. After several minutes, he returned inside, noting in the logbook that storm noise had created intermittent sounds resembling distant voices near the southern rocks, though no confirmed source had been identified. Throughout the early morning hours, the storm continued with little change. On 2 additional occasions, Daniel believed he heard the same faint calling sound, carried briefly by the wind before disappearing again into the surrounding noise of the weather. By sunrise, the storm had begun to weaken. The sea remained rough, but the winds gradually slowed, and the sky cleared enough to allow inspection of the coastline below. Daniel carefully scanned the shoreline through binoculars, checking for any signs of damaged boats or stranded travelers. No evidence of recent activity was visible, and harbor authorities later confirmed that no emergency signals had been reported during the night. When the next keeper arrived several days later, Daniel mentioned the unusual sounds casually during the routine handover discussion, suggesting that the storm winds may have carried distant echoes from vessels far offshore. Over the following years, a few additional keepers made brief notes describing similar experiences during severe storms. Faint, voice-like sounds occasionally carried by strong coastal winds, always brief and never clearly identifiable. Engineers inspecting the tower later suggested that certain wind directions could cause airflow to pass through small structural openings, producing tones that sometimes resembled distant human voices when heard from inside the building. Whether the sounds were caused entirely by wind conditions or by echoes traveling across the rocky coastline was never determined with certainty. No distress signals were ever associated with the reports. Today, the lighthouse continues operating automatically, and storms still pass across the same stretch of coast each winter, producing the familiar deep sounds of wind and waves moving through the tower's metal framework. And during the strongest coastal storms, when the wind moves across the rocks at just the right angle, a few maintenance workers have quietly remarked that the tower sometimes carries faint echoes that seem almost like distant voices, appearing briefly within the storm, then fading back into the sound of the sea. Story 5: The Lighthouse That Never Stayed Empty. On a remote stretch of northern coastline stood a lighthouse that had a reputation among local crews for never remaining unstaffed for long. Officially, the station was considered fully operational, yet records showed an unusual pattern. Keepers assigned to the tower often requested early transfers, sometimes only weeks after arriving. No formal incident reports were attached to these requests. Maintenance logs showed normal operation, supply deliveries remained on schedule, and inspections consistently found the structure in good condition. Still, the turnover of staff continued quietly over the years, noticed mainly by those who worked along the same coastal network. In the spring of 1974, a keeper named Martin was assigned to the station for what was expected to be a standard 3-month rotation. He had previously worked at several isolated coastal towers and was accustomed to the quiet routines that came with the role. During his first week, everything appeared entirely ordinary. The lantern rotated smoothly, the generator performed without issue, and the surrounding waters remained calm under long stretches of clear evening skies. It was on the 8th night that Martin noticed something unusual. While walking past the lower storage corridor after midnight, he thought he heard a door close somewhere deeper inside the building. A soft but unmistakable click, followed by silence. Assuming the wind had shifted one of the interior doors, he checked each room along the corridor. All doors were closed, exactly as he had left them earlier that evening. The following night, the same sound returned, this time followed by what seemed like a slow movement across the floor above the keeper's quarters. Not loud footsteps, but the faint suggestion of weight shifting across old wooden boards. Martin climbed the staircase to inspect the upper level, expecting to find a loose panel or unsecured equipment. Instead, the corridor stood empty, illuminated only by the dim maintenance light at the far end of the hall. Over the next several days, the sounds appeared occasionally and without pattern. A brief movement in the hallway, the quiet closing of a door he was certain had already been secured, or the faint creak of the stairwell when no one was climbing it. None of the noises were dramatic, yet their timing unsettled him slightly. They occurred only during the quietest hours of the night, when the sea was calm and the wind barely touched the outer walls of the tower. While reviewing earlier station records, Martin noticed that several previous keepers had requested reassignment sooner than expected, though none had written detailed explanations in the official logs. The entries simply recorded routine handovers without comment. One evening, just before dawn, Martin heard what sounded unmistakably like footsteps, moving slowly across the upper landing. He waited at the base of the staircase, listening, certain that the building should have been completely empty. The steps continued for several seconds, then stopped abruptly, leaving only the distant sound of waves below the cliffs. When he reached the upper level, nothing appeared out of place. Doors remained closed, and no equipment had shifted. The corridor was still, the silence returning as though the movement had never occurred. That morning, he wrote a brief note in the logbook. Light functioning normally. Intermittent internal building noises. Cause not yet identified. As the weeks passed, the sounds did not grow louder, but they became slightly more frequent. On several nights, Martin thought he heard movement in rooms that he had personally locked before retiring for the evening. One night, while sitting at the desk reviewing weather reports, he heard the unmistakable sound of the storage room handle turning slowly, followed by the gentle opening of the door. When he reached the corridor moments later, the door stood closed exactly as before. Near the end of his assignment, he requested an early transfer, citing routine staffing reasons without further explanation. The next keeper arrived shortly afterward, and the lighthouse continued operating as it always had. Over the following decades, the pattern quietly continued. Staff rotations occurred more frequently than at neighboring stations, though official maintenance reports remained entirely ordinary. Today, the lighthouse is fully automated, its keepers' quarters empty year-round. Maintenance teams who visit the station occasionally remark that the building remains unusually quiet, yet some have mentioned that certain doors seem to shift slightly overnight, even when no one has entered the tower. Whether those movements are caused by subtle structural changes, temperature shifts within the old building, or something never fully explained has never been determined. The lighthouse still stands against the edge of the sea, its beam turning steadily across the dark water. And on some calm nights, when the tower is completely empty, a few visitors have said the interior corridors can sound as though someone has just walked through them, moments before the silence returns again.